Namaskar. Well, friends, let me heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhasya, my audio visual podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the kind of vision that he had seen for our country as a whole. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, in this episode 40, the focus is on politics of constitution making. That is to say, formation of the Constituent Assembly, which approved the final version of the Constitution of India. Let us first understand the political backdrop. After the three roundtable conferences during the period 1930 to 1932, the British government had issued what was called a white paper. In response to the white paper, Congress Party, among other things, made an official demand for the first time in 1934 for setting up a Constituent Assembly for the purpose of making the Constitution of India. That was year 1934. Thereafter, in 1936, in the Firozpur Congress session, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his presidential address said, and I quote him, the demand for a Constituent Assembly was a cornerstone of Congress policy today. A positive response to this demand for Constituent Assembly came from the British 6 years later in 1942, and that too because of the World War II. In March 1942, with the growing Japanese threat in Asia, the then British Prime Minister, and Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister then, he appointed a new mission to India headed by Sir Stafford Cripps. The idea was to seek India's active involvement in the World War II. The draft declaration of the Cripps mission promised, among other things, an Indian Union with a dominion status and a Constituent Assembly to frame a new constitution. The members of this Constituent Assembly were going to be elected by the provincial assemblies, and in the case of princely states, they were going to be nominated by the rulers of those princely states. The Indian National Congress objected to the provision of dominion status instead of full independence that they had demanded. They were also not in favor of representation of the princely states in the proposed Constituent Assembly by the nominees of the rulers rather than the people of the princely states. Dr. Ambedkar himself was very unhappy about the proposal of the Cripps mission, but for altogether different reasons. Dr. Ambedkar clarified his position through a press release that he issued in the second half of July of 1942. Through the press release, Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar argued as follows. First, The proposed Constituent Assembly, he said, and I quote him, nothing short of a betrayal of the depressed classes, unquote. Secondly, the British government was panic stricken. He said the British government was panic stricken in the course of the war. And third thing that he said is that the panic was so great that the British government had conceded more than what was demanded by the Congress and by the Muslim League. Illustratively, Dr. Ambedkar argued the Congress, and I quote him, did not demand that the question of safeguards for minorities should be decided by the Constituent Assembly by a mere majority vote, unquote. Mere majority vote are the crucial words in this. And yet, the British government had given the additional right to them to decide this minority issue by a bare majority vote, unquote. The statement added, the depressed classes, and I quote Dr. Ambedkar again, are bound hand and foot and handed over to the caste Hindus. The mission's proposal, as said by Dr. Ambedkar, quoted, offer them nothing, stone instead of a bread. According to the press release, given that there were no communal quotas fixed in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar argued that there may not be any representatives of the depressed classes at all. And even if they are there, their voices cannot count. They will be in a hopeless minority, and a simple majority of vote would be enough to decide any question, no matter what its constitutional importance was. In sum, Dr. Ambedkar argued succinctly that the Cripps mission proposals, I'm quoting him, have literally thrown the depressed classes to the wolves, unquote. With the failure of the Cripps mission, Gandhiji decided to take a strong action to compel the British government to accept the Indian demand for full independence. Quit India resolution was passed in Mumbai on August 8, 1942. A nationwide non-violent mass struggle was launched by Mahatma Gandhi, which was ruthlessly crushed by the British government. Consequently, there was hardly any constitutional reform in the country till the World War II ended in the year 1945. In 1945, there was one more attempt at making a Swaraj constitution, that was the Sapru Committee report. The Sapru Committee report, among other things, called for setting up a constitution-making body where Hindus and Muslims would be equally represented. Sapru Committee report, despite its merit, received a scant attention. It did not create any impact on the mainstream political spectrum. Another turning point came in July 1945, wherein general elections were held in Britain. The Labour Party in Britain displaced the Tories and came to power. Winston Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee as the Prime Minister of Britain. Subsequently, Viceroy Lord Wavell announced in mid-September general elections to be held in India in 1945-46. The elections of 1945-46 were meant to serve two purposes. First was renewal of the provincial assemblies, first time since the elections of 1937, and secondly, endowing the country with a constituent assembly. In the intervening period, Dr. Ambedkar launched a new broad-based party. His first political party, you will recall, was the Independent Labour Party, which he floated in 1936. And here in 1945, he launched yet second political party, which was broad-based party. It was called All India Scheduled Caste Federation. This was going to fight as a party of the depressed classes on pan-India basis. The election results, which were announced in March 1946, turned out to be most disheartening for Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. The Congress party swept the general constituencies, while the Muslim League captured nearly all the Muslim seats. Dr. Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation fared very badly, winning only 2 seats in the provincial assemblies, one in Bengal and the other one in CP and Berar. This was indeed a major political setback to Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. In the meantime, on March 15, 1946, the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee unequivocally acknowledged India's right to attain full independence. Following this historic announcement, a British cabinet mission, which had 3 British cabinet ministers, arrived in India on March 25, 1946. The mission essentially aimed at planning the transfer of power from the British to the Indian leadership. Among others, the mission was supposed to conduct discussions with the major political leaders on 2 issues: the method of framing the constitution, and 2, setting up a constituent assembly. Dr. Ambedkar met the cabinet mission on April 5th, 1946 and presented the case for the depressed classes. In this critical meeting, Dr. Ambedkar argued that, and I quote him, he did not want a constituent assembly at all, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar argued that the constituent assembly would be dominated by the caste Hindus and the scheduled caste members would be no more than a small minority which would always be outvoted, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar, and this is something which is not widely known, Dr. Ambedkar in fact suggested an alternative. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the tasks envisaged for the Constituent Assembly should be divided into 2 categories. First, constitutional questions, and second, communal questions, that is to say, Hindu-Muslim problem. Dr. Ambedkar forcefully argued that the first category, that is to say, the constitutional questions, are a job for experts, and hence that set of issues may be referred to a commission presided over by an eminent constitutional lawyer, either from Britain or from the US, supported by 2 Indian experts. At that point, Dr. Ambedkar, of course, did not know that the responsibility was soon going to be entrusted to him personally. Dr. Ambedkar's proposal evidently shows his highest degree of professionalism. The cabinet mission proposed its plan on May 16, 1946, which came to be called the Plan of May 16. The plan envisaged creation of a united dominion of India as a loose confederation of provinces. The plan also proposed a mechanism for the election of a constituent assembly. When this plan was rejected by both Congress as well as Muslim League, an alternate plan was proposed that was called Plan of June 16. According to the cabinet mission's plan, the British government had envisaged the election of a constituent assembly by provincial assemblies without giving untouchables any guarantee of representation. According to the plan, the constituent assembly was going to be composed of the representatives chosen by the members of provincial legislatures. And for this purpose, and this is very important, members of the provincial legislatures were divided into three categories: Muslims, Sikhs, and the general. Each one with a fixed quota of seats. Each category had a separate electorate, whereby the Muslim representatives of the Constituent Assembly were to be elected by the Muslim members of the provincial legislatures. The Sikh representatives were to be chosen by Sikh members of provincial legislatures, and the general representatives by all the rest, including Hindus, scheduled caste, Indian Christians, and so on. All the rest. Dr. Ambedkar was very, very upset because, unlike the Muslims and the Sikhs, the untouchables were not given the right to nominate their representatives. The elections to the Constituent Assembly of India were completed by August 1946. It consisted of 296 members from the British Indian provinces, 208 from the Congress, and 73 from the Muslim League. With only 2 representatives elected to provincial assemblies from the Scheduled Caste Federation, Dr. Ambedkar, of course, had absolutely no chance to be a part of the Constituent Assembly. Fortunately, and this is a great fortune, Jogendranath Mandal, a Scheduled Caste Federation leader from Bengal, he came forward. In a surprise move, he managed to get the required numbers to get Dr. Ambedkar elected for the Constituent Assembly from the Bengal province. That was on 19th July 1946. It may be noted that Jogendranath Mandal is not the same Mandal from the Mandal Commission. Jogendranath Mandal, interestingly, went to East Pakistan after the partition of India and became temporary chairman of Pakistan's Constituent Assembly, and later he became Pakistan's first minister for law and labor. When Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar entered the Constituent Assembly, It was the beginning of a new inning which literally created history that we are going to see in the subsequent episodes. Well, friends, let us conclude our this session here today. But before I leave, let me request you, if you like this audio visual podcast series Bhim Bhasya, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.